Marcus Chen had always preferred the shadows. At 38 years old, he worked as a night janitor at Fort Braxton, one of the largest military training bases in the country. Most people barely noticed him as he quietly pushed his cleaning cart through the hallways, emptying trash bins and mopping floors while the soldiers slept. Marcus wore the same faded blue uniform every night, with Chen stitched above the left pocket in simple black letters. His black hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and he had the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen more than most people his age, but he never talked about his past. He just did his job, collected his paycheck, and went home to his small apartment on the edge of town. The night shift suited Marcus perfectly. He could work in peace, listening to the distant sounds of the base settling down for the evening. Sometimes he would hear the faint echoes of drill sergeants barking orders at late-night training sessions, or the rumble of military vehicles moving across the grounds. These sounds didn't bother him. In fact, they were almost comforting in their familiarity. Fort Braxton was home to thousands of soldiers, from fresh recruits just starting their military careers to seasoned officers with decades of experience. The base sprawled across hundreds of acres, with dozens of buildings housing everything from barracks and mess halls to command centers and training facilities. Marcus knew every inch of the place after 3 years of cleaning it. Most of the soldiers treated Marcus with polite indifference. A few would nod when they passed him in the corridors, and some of the older sergeants would exchange brief pleasantries about the weather or upcoming holidays. But for the most part, Marcus was invisible to the military personnel who filled the base during the day. That was exactly how Marcus liked it. However, not everyone on the base was content to leave Marcus alone. There was a group of 5 recruits who had arrived 6 months ago and seemed to take pleasure in making life difficult for anyone they considered beneath them. They called themselves the Pack, and were led by a tall, muscular young man named Bradley Hutchins. Hutchins was 22 years old and came from a wealthy family back in Connecticut. His father was a successful businessman who had connections throughout the military and political world. Hutchins never let anyone forget about his privileged background, and he seemed to believe that his family's status made him better than everyone else on the base. The other members of the Pack were equally arrogant. There was Tommy Russo from Boston, whose uncle was supposedly some high-ranking general. Kevin Park from California, who constantly bragged about his family's military tradition going back 3 generations. Jake Morrison from Texas, who claimed his grandfather had been a war hero. And finally, Derek Williams from Florida, whose father worked for a major defense contractor. These 5 recruits had formed their little clique within days of arriving at Fort Braxton. They stuck together during training, ate together in the mess hall, and spent their free time plotting ways to assert their dominance over anyone they perceived as weak or inferior. Marcus had first encountered the Pack during his 2nd week on the job. He had been cleaning the main corridor in Building C when the 5 recruits came swaggering down the hallway, talking loudly about their upcoming weekend passes. They barely glanced at Marcus as they walked past, but he could sense their dismissive attitude even without making eye contact. Over the following months, the Pack's behavior toward Marcus had gradually escalated. At first, they would simply ignore him or make snide comments under their breath as they passed. Then they started deliberately dropping trash on floors that Marcus had just cleaned, forcing him to go back over areas he had already finished. More recently, they had begun actively harassing him. They would accidentally bump into his cleaning cart, knocking supplies to the floor. They would make loud comments about immigrants taking American jobs, even though Marcus had been born and raised in California. They would sometimes block his path in narrow corridors, forcing him to wait while they took their time moving aside. Marcus endured all of this harassment without complaint. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best response to aggression was no response at all. He would simply clean up whatever mess the Pack made, restock his cart when they knocked things over, and continue with his work as if nothing had happened. but the pack seemed frustrated by Marcus's lack of reaction. They wanted to get a rise out of him, to provoke some kind of emotional response that would justify whatever they had planned for him. When Marcus refused to take the bait, they only became more determined to break his composure. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday night in late September. Marcus was working in the recreational area of Building D, which housed a large common room with pool tables, video games, and vending machines. It was nearly midnight, and the area was supposed to be empty according to the base schedule. Marcus had just finished mopping the floor and was preparing to move his cart to the next area when the pack appeared in the doorway. All 5 recruits were wearing their off-duty civilian clothes instead of their military uniforms, which immediately put Marcus on alert. Soldiers weren't supposed to be in the recreational area this late at night, especially not in civilian clothing. "Well, well, well," Hutchins said with a nasty grin as he stepped into the room. "Look who we have here, our favorite little janitor, all alone with his mop and bucket." The other 4 recruits spread out behind Hutchins, effectively blocking the only exit from the room. Marcus quickly assessed the situation and realized he was trapped. The nearest security station was 3 buildings away, and even if he could call for help, it would take several minutes for anyone to respond. "Good evening," Marcus said quietly, not looking directly at any of the recruits. "I'm almost finished here. I can come back later if you need to use the room." Hutchins laughed and took another step forward. "Oh, we're not here to play pool, Chen. We're here to have a little chat with you." Marcus carefully set down his mop and moved slightly away from his cleaning cart. He kept his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, but every muscle in his body was tense and ready to react if necessary. "Is there something I can help you with?" Marcus asked, still maintaining his calm, respectful tone. "Yeah, actually there is," Tommy Russo chimed in from behind Hutchins. "We've been wondering about you, Chen. You've been working here for what, 3 years? And in all that time, you've never once stood up for yourself, never complained when we mess with your stuff, never even raised your voice." Kevin Park nodded in agreement. "It's like you're some kind of robot or something. Don't you have any pride at all?" Marcus didn't respond to the question. He knew that anything he said would only encourage them to continue their harassment. Instead, he focused on looking for potential escape routes or anything in the room that could be used for defense if the situation turned violent. Jake Morrison stepped forward and kicked Marcus's cleaning cart, sending it rolling across the room and scattering supplies everywhere. "My buddy asked you a question, Chen. The polite thing to do would be to answer." "I just want to do my job and go home," Marcus said quietly. "I don't want any trouble." Derek Williams laughed harshly. "Too late for that, don't you think? You've been asking for trouble ever since you started working here, walking around like you own the place, acting all mysterious and superior." Hutchins raised his hand to silence the others. "Here's what I think, Chen. I think you're hiding something. I think there's more to you than meets the eye. Maybe you're not really supposed to be working here. Maybe you're some kind of spy or terrorist or something." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. If these recruits started making accusations like that, it could lead to an investigation that would expose things about his past that needed to remain buried. He had to defuse this situation quickly and quietly. "I'm just a janitor," Marcus said firmly. "I have all the proper clearances and documentation for working on this base. You can check with Human Resources if you have any concerns." "Oh, we're not going to bother HR with this," Hutchins said with a malicious smile. "We're going to handle this ourselves, right here and now. See, we think you need to learn some respect for American soldiers. We think you need to understand your place in the pecking order around here." The 5 recruits began to close in on Marcus from different directions. He could see the excitement in their eyes, the anticipation of violence that some people craved. These weren't hardened soldiers or experienced fighters. They were young men drunk on their own perceived power, looking to assert dominance over someone they saw as weak and defenseless. But Marcus Chen was neither weak nor defenseless. As Hutchins reached out to grab Marcus's shirt, the janitor moved with lightning speed. In one fluid motion, he caught Hutchins's wrist, twisted it sharply, and used the recruit's own momentum to send him stumbling into Kevin Park. Both young men crashed to the floor in a tangle of arms and legs. Tommy Russo charged forward with his fists raised, but Marcus sidestepped the clumsy attack and delivered a precise strike to Russo's solar plexus that dropped him to his knees, gasping for air. Jake Morrison tried to tackle Marcus from behind, but the older man sensed the attack coming and pivoted at the last second, allowing Morrison to crash headfirst into a pool table. Derek Williams was the only member of the pack still standing, and he suddenly didn't look nearly as confident as he had a few moments earlier. Marcus turned to face him with a calm, measured expression that somehow managed to be more intimidating than any angry scowl. "This ends now," Marcus said quietly. "You're going to help your friends back to their barracks, and we're all going to forget this ever happened." Williams looked around at his fallen comrades, all of whom were groaning and struggling to get back on their feet. Hutchins had a bloody nose from his collision with Park. Russo was still having trouble breathing, Morrison was holding his head and looking dazed, and Park was nursing what looked like a sprained ankle. You can't do this to us," Williams stammered. "We're soldiers. You're just a janitor." Marcus took a step forward, and Williams instinctively backed away. "I'm the janitor who just defended himself against 5 attackers. If you want to explain to your commanding officers how that happened, that's your choice. But I don't think it's going to reflect very well on your military careers." For a moment, Williams looked like he was going to argue further. Then he glanced around the room again, taking in the scattered cleaning supplies, the overturned cart, and his friends still recovering from their brief encounter with Marcus's unexpectedly effective self-defense skills. "This isn't over, Chen," Williams said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied calmly. "It's very much over." Williams helped Hutchins to his feet and supported him as the group slowly made their way toward the exit. Tommy Russo was still wheezing, but managed to walk on his own. Jake Morrison leaned heavily on Kevin Park as they limped out of the room together. Before they reached the doorway, Hutchins turned back to glare at Marcus. Despite his bloody nose and disheveled appearance, he still managed to project an aura of arrogance and entitlement. "You have no idea who you just messed with, Chen," Hutchins said through gritted teeth. "My father has connections throughout the military. When he hears about this, you're going to wish you had never set foot on this base." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Your father's connections won't help you explain why 5 trained soldiers couldn't handle one middle-aged janitor. But if you want to make this incident official, I'm willing to cooperate with any investigation." Hutchins's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he allowed Williams to guide him out of the room, muttering threats and curses under his breath. Once the pack had disappeared down the corridor, Marcus stood alone in the recreational room, surrounded by the evidence of the brief confrontation. He took a deep breath and began gathering his scattered cleaning supplies, methodically restocking his cart as if nothing unusual had happened. But even as Marcus went through the familiar motions of his job, he knew that things had changed. The pack wouldn't let this incident go unpunished, especially Bradley Hutchins with his wounded pride and family connections. They would regroup, plan something more serious, and come after him again. Marcus had hoped to avoid this kind of attention for the remainder of his time at Fort Braxton. He had a good thing going with his quiet night shift and his anonymous existence on the edges of base life. But sometimes the past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you tried to run from it. As he finished cleaning up the recreational room and prepared to move on to the next area on his route, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in one of the darkened windows. For just a moment, he didn't see a tired, middle-aged janitor in a faded blue uniform. Instead, he saw the ghost of someone he used to be, someone whose skills and training were far beyond anything the pack could imagine. Marcus shook his head and turned away from the window. That person was gone, buried under 3 years of mopping floors and emptying trash cans. But if Bradley Hutchins and his friends insisted on digging up the past, they might not like what they found. The rest of Marcus's shift passed without incident. He completed his cleaning route, checked in with the overnight security desk, and drove home to his small apartment as the sun began to rise over Fort Braxton. But sleep didn't come easily that morning. Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the confrontation in the recreational room and wondering how long it would be before the pack made their next move. He didn't have to wait long for his answer. 3 days after the incident in the recreational room, Marcus arrived for his night shift to find his supervisor waiting for him in the janitor's storage area. Frank Rodriguez was a retired Army sergeant who had been running the cleaning crew at Fort Braxton for over a decade. He was a fair man who treated his workers well, but Marcus could tell from his expression that this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Marcus, we need to talk," Frank said, closing the door behind them. "I got a call from Human Resources this afternoon. Seems there's been some kind of complaint filed against you." Marcus continued putting on his work gloves without changing his expression. "What kind of complaint?" "Assault," Frank said bluntly. 5 recruits claim you attacked them in Building D 3 nights ago. Says you used some kind of martial arts on them, left one of them with a broken nose and another with a concussion. Marcus finished checking his cleaning supplies before responding. "Did they mention what they were doing in Building D at midnight? Or why they were surrounding me in a room with no witnesses?" Frank studied Marcus's face carefully. "No, they didn't go into much detail about that part. But the thing is, Marcus, these aren't just any recruits. One of them has a father who's been calling the base commander all morning. This Hutchins kid apparently comes from some important family with military connections going way back." "I defended myself," Marcus said simply. 5 against 1, after hours, in a restricted area. I think any reasonable investigation will show that I was the victim, not the aggressor." "That's what I told HR," Frank replied. "But the problem is, there's going to be an investigation either way, and when they start looking into your background, well..." He trailed off meaningfully. Marcus understood what Frank was implying. His employment file at Fort Braxton was deliberately sparse, containing only the minimum information required to obtain his security clearance for working on the base. There were gaps in his work history, vague references to previous government employment, and medical records that had been heavily redacted for reasons of national security. "How much time do I have?" Marcus asked. "The investigation starts tomorrow. Internal Affairs is sending someone over to interview everyone involved. But Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." Frank moved closer and lowered his voice. "I've been watching you for 3 years. The way you move, the way you carry yourself, the way you handle yourself in difficult situations. You're not really a janitor, are you?" Marcus met his supervisor's gaze without flinching. "I am now." "But you weren't always." "No," Marcus admitted quietly. "I wasn't always." Frank nodded slowly. "I thought so. Look, I was in the Army for 22 years before I took this job. I've seen a lot of different types of soldiers, and I know the difference between someone who's been trained in basic hand-to-hand combat and someone who's been trained for something much more specialized. Frank, the less you know about my past, the better it is for both of us." "Maybe so. But here's the thing, Marcus. These recruits aren't going to let this go, especially this Hutchins kid. Word around the base is that he's been talking to his father's friends, trying to get you kicked off the base or maybe even arrested. And if they start digging too deep into your background..." Marcus understood the implications. His current identity as a janitor was carefully constructed but not designed to withstand a serious investigation by military intelligence. There were people in very high places who knew who Marcus Chen really was and what he had done in service to his country, but there were also people who might prefer that certain information never came to light. "I appreciate the warning," Marcus said. "I'll handle it." "How?" "I don't know yet, but I'll figure something out." Frank looked like he wanted to say more, but just then there was a knock on the storage room door. Both men turned as one of the other janitors poked his head inside. "Frank, there's some Army guys out here asking for Marcus. They're not MPs, but they look pretty official." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. If Internal Affairs was already here, that meant the investigation was moving much faster than Frank had indicated. Someone with serious influence was pushing to get this resolved quickly, which suggested that Bradley Hutchins's father had even more connections than Marcus had realized. "Send them in," Frank said reluctantly. Two men in Army dress uniforms entered the storage room. The first was a major in his early 40s with the lean build and alert eyes of a career military officer. The second was younger, probably a lieutenant, carrying a folder full of paperwork and a recording device. "Mr. Chen," the major said formally, "I'm Major Williams from Internal Affairs. This is Lieutenant Foster. We need to speak with you about an incident that occurred 3 nights ago in Building D." Marcus noticed that the major shared the same last name as Derek Williams, one of the PAC members who had been present during the confrontation. That couldn't be a coincidence. Either the major was related to one of his accusers, or someone had deliberately assigned him to this case, knowing that it would create a conflict of interest. "I understand there's been a complaint," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm happy to cooperate with your investigation." "Good. We'll need you to come with us to provide a formal statement. The interview will be recorded, and you have the right to have a representative present if you choose." Marcus considered his options. He could request a lawyer, but that would only delay the inevitable and might make him look guilty. He could try to contact some of his old friends in the intelligence community, but that would mean revealing his location and current identity to people who might have their own reasons for wanting to keep him quiet. "I don't need a representative," Marcus said finally. "Let's get this over with." The major seemed surprised by Marcus's cooperative attitude. "Very well. Lieutenant Foster, please make note that the subject is voluntarily participating in this interview without legal representation." As they walked toward the main administrative building, Marcus caught sight of the pack gathered near the entrance to the mess hall. All 5 recruits were watching the proceedings with obvious satisfaction. Bradley Hutchins still had a bandage across his nose, and he was smirking as he watched Marcus being escorted by the Internal Affairs officers. The interview room was a small, windowless space with gray concrete walls and fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across everything. Marcus sat at a metal table facing Major Williams, while Lieutenant Foster set up the recording equipment and arranged his paperwork. "This interview is being conducted on September 30th at 21:30 hours, Major Williams said for the record. Present are Major David Williams and Lieutenant James Foster from Internal Affairs, and Mr. Marcus Chen, employed as a maintenance worker at Fort Braxton." Marcus noticed that the major had identified himself as David Williams, confirming his suspicion about the family connection. This entire investigation was compromised from the start, which meant that someone wanted him gone badly enough to ignore proper procedures. "Mr. Chen, please state your full name and current position for the record." "Marcus Chen, night shift janitor for facility services." "How long have you been employed at Fort Braxton?" 3 years and 2 months. "Have you had any previous conflicts with military personnel during that time?" "No." Major Williams consulted his notes. "According to the complaint filed by recruit Bradley Hutchins, you assaulted him and 4 other recruits in the recreational area of Building D at approximately midnight on September 27th. How do you respond to that allegation?" "I defended myself when 5 recruits cornered me in a restricted area after hours," Marcus said calmly. "They blocked my exit and made threatening statements. When one of them attempted to grab me, I used minimal force to protect myself and escape the situation." "Minimal force?" Lieutenant Foster interjected. "Mr. Chen, one of those recruits has a broken nose and another suffered a concussion. That doesn't sound minimal to me." Marcus turned to look at the lieutenant. 5 trained soldiers against 1 middle-aged janitor. I used exactly as much force as necessary to defend myself. Nothing more." Major Williams leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, these recruits claim that you demonstrated combat skills far beyond what any civilian janitor should possess. They're saying you moved like someone with advanced military training. Can you explain that?" Here it was. The question that Marcus had been dreading, but also expecting. His answer would determine whether this investigation stayed focused on the immediate incident or expanded into a much more dangerous examination of his background. "I grew up in a rough neighborhood," Marcus said carefully. "I took some self-defense classes when I was younger. Nothing special, just basic techniques for protecting yourself." "Which neighborhood was that?" Lieutenant Foster asked, pen poised over his notepad. Marcus realized he was walking into a trap. Any specific details he provided could be verified, and too much evasion would only make him look more suspicious. But before he could answer, there was a sharp knock on the interview room door. Major Williams looked annoyed at the interruption. "We're conducting an interview. This had better be important." The door opened to reveal a military police sergeant. "Sir, Colonel Harrison needs to see you immediately. All 3 of you." Major Williams exchanged a glance with Lieutenant Foster. "We're in the middle of a formal investigation, Sergeant. Can't this wait?" "No, sir." The colonel was very clear. "He wants to see you right now." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Colonel Harrison was the base commander, a man whose authority superseded everyone else at Fort Braxton. If he was getting personally involved in this investigation, it meant that someone very high up the military food chain was taking an interest in Marcus Chen. The 3 men gathered up their materials and followed the MP sergeant through the corridors of the administrative building. As they walked, Marcus tried to think of any reason why the base commander would insert himself into what should have been a routine disciplinary matter. Colonel Harrison's office was located on the top floor of the building, with large windows overlooking the parade ground and training facilities. The colonel himself was a tall, distinguished man in his mid-50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent his entire adult life in positions of command. "Gentlemen, please have a seat," Colonel Harrison said as they entered his office. "Major Williams, I understand you're conducting an investigation into an incident involving Mr. Chen here." "Yes, sir. 5 recruits have filed assault charges against him. We were just beginning to take his formal statement when you called us up here." Colonel Harrison picked up a thick file from his desk and opened it. "Before you go any further with this investigation, Major, I think there are some things you need to know about Mr. Chen's background." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. If Colonel Harrison had access to his real military file, then the carefully constructed anonymity of his civilian life was about to come crashing down. But there was nothing he could do except sit quietly and wait to see how much the colonel knew. "Mr. Chen," the colonel said, looking directly at him, "would you mind standing up for a moment?" Marcus rose from his chair, uncertain about where this was heading. Colonel Harrison walked around his desk and approached him slowly, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Turn around, please." Marcus complied, turning to face away from the colonel. He heard the sound of footsteps as Harrison circled around him, examining him from different angles. Then the colonel stopped directly behind him. "Major Williams," the colonel said quietly, "I need you and Lieutenant Foster to step outside for a moment. I'll call you back in when I'm ready." "Sir, with all due respect, we're in the middle of an official investigation. Proper procedure requires that—" "Major!" The colonel's voice carried the unmistakable authority of a man who wasn't accustomed to having his orders questioned. I said step outside. Now. The two internal affairs officers reluctantly left the office, closing the door behind them. Marcus remained standing with his back to the colonel, waiting to see what would happen next. "You can turn around now," Colonel Harrison said. When Marcus faced him again, the colonel was holding something small and metallic in his hand. It looked like some kind of military insignia or badge, but Marcus couldn't make out the details from across the room. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Have we met before?" Marcus studied the colonel's face carefully. There was something familiar about his features, but he couldn't quite place where or when he might have encountered him. "I'm not sure, sir. Your face is familiar, but I can't remember the specific circumstances." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. "That's understandable. It was a long time ago, and the circumstances were quite different. But I never forget a face, especially one belonging to someone who saved my life." Marcus felt a jolt of recognition as buried memories began to surface. Afghanistan, 2009. A convoy ambush in a remote mountain pass. A young captain trapped in a burning vehicle while enemy fighters closed in from 3 sides. And Marcus, operating under a different name and carrying credentials that identified him as a weapons systems contractor, making the split-second decision to abandon his cover and extract the wounded officer. "Captain Harrison," Marcus said quietly. "Helmand Province." "Colonel Harrison now," the older man replied with a slight smile. "And you're not Marcus Chen, are you? At least that wasn't the name on your ID when you pulled me out of that burning Humvee?" Marcus remained silent, but his expression confirmed what the colonel already suspected. "I tried to track you down after that incident," Harrison continued. "Wanted to put you in for a commendation, maybe get you transferred to my unit. But when I went looking for David Park from Blackwater Security, I discovered that no such person existed. Your credentials were perfect forgeries, your background was completely fabricated, and you had disappeared without a trace." The colonel walked back to his desk and picked up the thick file he had been examining earlier. "It took me years to figure out who you really were. Had to call in a lot of favors from friends in intelligence circles. Even then, most of your real file is classified above my pay grade. But I learned enough." Marcus waited for the other shoe to drop. If Colonel Harrison knew his real identity, then he also knew about the operations Marcus had been involved in, the classified missions that had taken him to some of the darkest corners of the world. More importantly, he would know about the incident that had ended Marcus's military career and forced him into hiding. "The thing is," the colonel continued, "I also learned about what happened to you, how you were burned by your own people, left to take the blame for an operation that went sideways due to political interference, how they threw you under the bus to protect some senator's reputation." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Colonel Harrison seemed sympathetic to his situation, but that didn't necessarily mean he was safe. Military officers had their own loyalties and obligations, and sometimes those trumped personal feelings. "So here's what's going to happen," the colonel said firmly. "I'm going to put an end to this investigation before it goes any further. Those 5 recruits are going to withdraw their complaint, and you're going to continue working here without any further harassment. Sir, with all due respect, I'm not sure you can just make this disappear." "One of those recruits has family connections. Bradley Hutchins," the colonel interrupted. "Yes. I know all about his father. Congressman Robert Hutchins, member of the House Armed Services Committee. Very influential man with a lot of friends in the Pentagon." The colonel opened his desk drawer and pulled out a phone. "But Congressman Hutchins isn't the only one with connections in Washington. And when I explain to him exactly who his son tried to assault, I think he'll be very eager to make this whole incident disappear." Marcus watched as Colonel Harrison dialed a number from memory. While he waited for the call to connect, the colonel held up the small badge he had been examining earlier. Marcus could now see that it was a Medal of Valor, one of the highest decorations that could be awarded to a member of the United States military. Congressman Hutchins? This is Colonel Harrison at Fort Braxton. I'm calling about your son, Bradley. Yes, sir. I understand he's filed a complaint. That's actually why I'm calling. I think you and I need to have a conversation about exactly who your boy tried to pick a fight with. Marcus couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he could see the colonel's expression grow more serious as he continued talking. Sir, I'm going to send you some declassified portions of a military file. I can't share the details over the phone, but I can tell you that the man your son assaulted has more combat decorations than most generals. Yes, sir, I said, assaulted. 5 trained soldiers against 1 man. And they all ended up on the floor. There was a long pause as the congressman apparently asked questions or made objections. With all due respect, sir, the colonel continued, if this incident becomes public, it's not going to reflect well on your son or your family. The media loves stories about privileged young men abusing their positions to harass working-class veterans. Yes, sir, I did say veteran. And not just any veteran. Another pause, shorter this time. I thought you might see it that way. I'll expect to hear from your son within the hour. And Congressman, you might want to have a serious conversation with the boy about picking his battles more carefully in the future. Colonel Harrison hung up the phone and turned back to Marcus. That should take care of the political pressure. Now I need to deal with Major Williams and his investigation. Colonel Harrison called Major Williams and Lieutenant Foster back into his office 5 minutes later. Both internal affairs officers looked confused and slightly irritated at having their investigation interrupted, but they maintained their professional demeanor as they took their seats. Major Williams, the colonel began, I'm afraid there's been a significant development in your investigation that changes everything. Sir, what kind of development? The colonel held up the thick file he had been studying. It turns out that Mr. Chen here isn't exactly who he appears to be. His background is considerably more complex than his employment records would suggest. Lieutenant Foster looked skeptical. Sir, we've reviewed his file. He's a civilian janitor with basic security clearance. There's nothing in his background that would justify... That's because you've been looking at the wrong file, Colonel Harrison interrupted. He opened the thick folder and removed a photograph, which he placed on the desk facing the 2 officers. Major Williams, do you recognize the man in this picture? Major Williams studied the photograph carefully. It showed a younger Marcus Chen in military dress uniform, standing at attention with several other soldiers. The photo appeared to have been taken at some kind of formal ceremony, with flags and military dignitaries visible in the background. That looks like Mr. Chen, the major said slowly, but he's wearing a military uniform. Is this some kind of costume or... That uniform is real, Colonel Harrison said firmly. So are the decorations he's wearing. Mr. Chen, or rather, Master Sergeant Daniel Chen, formerly of the United States Army Special Forces. Marcus winced at hearing his real name spoken aloud. He had spent 3 years building his civilian identity, and now it was being stripped away in a matter of minutes. Lieutenant Foster was examining the photograph more closely. Sir, those decorations, is that a Purple Heart? And a Silver Star? Among others, the colonel confirmed. Mr. Chen served 15 years in special operations, including 7 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. He was awarded the Purple Heart twice for wounds received in action, the Silver Star for gallantry in combat, and the Medal of Valor for extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty. Major Williams was starting to look uncomfortable. Sir, if he's a decorated veteran, why is he working as a janitor? And why isn't any of this in his employment file? Colonel Harrison closed the folder. Because Master Sergeant Chen was forced to retire under circumstances that required him to adopt a new identity for his own protection. He was involved in a classified operation that went wrong due to political interference, and certain people in Washington needed a scapegoat to avoid taking responsibility for their mistakes. The colonel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base grounds. The men who threw him under the bus are still in positions of power, which means that Mr. Chen has been living under an assumed identity for the past 3 years. His real military records are sealed at the highest levels of classification. Marcus remained silent throughout this explanation. He had never expected his past to be revealed like this, but he had to admit that Colonel Harrison was handling the situation with more skill and discretion than he had thought possible. "Now," the colonel continued, turning back to face the internal affairs officers, "let's discuss the incident that brought us all here. 5 recruits cornered an unarmed man in a restricted area after midnight and attempted to assault him. That man turned out to be a highly trained special operations veteran with 15 years of combat experience. The fact that all 5 attackers survived the encounter speaks to Mr. Chen's restraint and professional discipline." Lieutenant Foster was furiously taking notes. "Sir, are you saying that the assault charges should be dropped?" "I'm saying that there were no assault charges to begin with. What happened was a clear case of self-defense by a veteran against multiple attackers. If anyone should be facing charges, it's those 5 recruits for harassment, being in a restricted area without authorization, and assault." Major Williams looked like he wanted to argue, but he was clearly out of his depth. "Sir, what about the complaint from Congressman Hutchins? He's been calling the base commander all morning demanding action." "Congressman Hutchins has withdrawn his son's complaint," Colonel Harrison said with a slight smile. "After I explained the full circumstances to him, he decided that it would be better for everyone involved if this incident was simply forgotten." "And the other 4 recruits?" "They'll be withdrawing their complaints as well. In fact, I suspect they'll be requesting transfers to other bases in the very near future. Young men with such poor judgment probably aren't well suited for the elite training programs we run here at Fort Braxton." Marcus was amazed at how quickly and efficiently Colonel Harrison was dismantling the case against him. But he was also concerned about the long-term implications of having his real identity exposed. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, "what about operational security? My cover identity was put in place for specific reasons." The colonel nodded. "I understand your concerns, Master Sergeant. The people who are aware of your real identity can be counted on one hand, and they all have security clearances above top secret. Your cover will remain intact for everyone else on this base. And if word gets out anyway, then you'll have the full protection of the United States Army. I've already made some phone calls to friends at the Pentagon. If anyone tries to retaliate against you for what happened in Afghanistan, they'll have to go through me first." Lieutenant Foster was still trying to process everything he had heard. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand. If Master Sergeant Chen is a decorated war hero, why was he forced into hiding in the first place?" Colonel Harrison's expression darkened. "Because politicians care more about protecting their careers than protecting the soldiers who risk their lives to carry out their orders. When that classified operation went sideways, someone needed to take the blame. It was easier to sacrifice one Special Forces sergeant than to admit that a senator's son had leaked intelligence to the enemy." Marcus felt a familiar anger building in his chest. Even after 3 years, thinking about what had happened in Afghanistan still made his blood boil. He had lost 5 men on that mission, good soldiers who had died because some politician's kid wanted to play spy games with classified information. "The operation was compromised from the beginning," Marcus said, speaking publicly about the incident for the first time in 3 years. "We were sent in to extract a high-value target who turned out to be working for the other side. It was a setup, and we walked right into it." "But you got your men out," Colonel Harrison said. All except 5 of the best soldiers I ever served with," Marcus interrupted, his voice heavy with grief and guilt. "They died because I trusted intelligence that had been contaminated by political considerations." The room fell silent as everyone processed what Marcus had revealed. Lieutenant Foster looked particularly shaken by the implications of what he was hearing. "Sir," the lieutenant said to Colonel Harrison, If what you're saying is true, then this goes way beyond a simple assault case. This is about a cover-up that cost soldiers their lives. Yes, it is, the colonel replied grimly. And that's why Master Sergeant Chen's identity must remain protected. There are people in Washington who would be very unhappy if certain details about that operation became public knowledge. Major Williams was beginning to understand the full scope of what he had stumbled into. Sir, what do you want us to do with our investigation report? There will be no investigation report, Colonel Harrison said firmly. As far as anyone is concerned, this incident never happened. The recruits withdrew their complaint due to insufficient evidence, and Mr. Chen will continue his work here without any further harassment. And if someone asks questions, then you refer them to me. I'll handle any inquiries from higher up the chain of command. The colonel dismissed the internal affairs officers and asked Marcus to remain behind. Once they were alone, Harrison poured 2 cups of coffee and offered one to Marcus. That was quite a performance, Marcus said, accepting the coffee gratefully. It wasn't a performance. Everything I told them was true, even if I left out some of the more classified details. Marcus took a sip of his coffee and studied the colonel's face. How much do you really know about what happened in Afghanistan? More than you might think. After I figured out who you were, I made it my business to learn about that operation. I have friends in intelligence circles who were willing to share some off-the-record information. And Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair. And I know that you were set up to fail. I know that Senator Morrison's son was feeding information to insurgent groups in exchange for money and drugs. I know that you tried to abort the mission when you realized the intelligence was compromised, but you were ordered to proceed anyway. And I know that you saved 7 men from that ambush when you could have just saved yourself. Marcus set down his coffee cup with trembling hands. Even after 3 years, hearing the details of that night still affected him deeply. I should have done more, he said quietly. I should have refused the order. I should have... You should have nothing, Colonel Harrison interrupted. You did your job under impossible circumstances, and you brought as many men home as you could. The fact that politicians threw you under the bus afterward doesn't change that. The 2 men sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Colonel Harrison reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. I have something that belongs to you, he said, opening the box to reveal a military decoration that Marcus hadn't seen in 3 years. It was the Medal of Valor, the same decoration that Colonel Harrison had been examining earlier. But this wasn't just any Medal of Valor. This was Marcus's Medal of Valor, the one that had been stripped from him when he was forced into retirement. How did you get this? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I told you I had friends in high places. When I learned what had really happened to you, I made some calls. This medal was never officially revoked, despite what you were told. The paperwork was buried in bureaucratic red tape, but the decoration itself was simply stored in a Pentagon vault. Marcus reached out and touched the medal with one finger, as if he was afraid it might disappear. I thought it was gone forever. Heroes don't lose their medals because of political convenience, Colonel Harrison said firmly. This decoration represents the lives you saved and the sacrifices you made in service to your country. No politician can take that away from you. The colonel closed the box and handed it to Marcus. The question is, what do you want to do now? You can continue working here as a janitor if that's what makes you comfortable, but you could also come back to active duty if you're interested. I could use someone with your skills and experience in my command structure. Marcus stared at the wooden box in his hands, thinking about everything that had happened over the past 3 years. He had found a kind of peace in his anonymous life as a janitor, but he had also felt like he was hiding from who he really was. I need some time to think about it, he said finally. Take all the time you need. In the meantime, you won't have any more trouble from those recruits. I've already spoken to their commanding officers, and they're being transferred to different bases effective immediately. "What about Bradley Hutchins? He seemed pretty determined to cause trouble for me." Colonel Harrison smiled grimly. "Young Mr. Hutchins learned this morning that his father is very disappointed in his behavior. Apparently, Congressman Hutchins served in Vietnam and has great respect for special operations veterans. When he found out that his son had tried to assault a Medal of Valor recipient, he was displeased. And the other four? They're all facing disciplinary action for being in a restricted area without authorization. Their military careers are effectively over before they even got started." Marcus stood up to leave, still clutching the wooden box containing his medal. "Colonel, I want to thank you for what you've done. I never expected—" "You don't need to thank me," Harrison interrupted. "You saved my life in Afghanistan, and you've earned the respect and protection that comes with your service record. Besides, it was about time someone stood up for what's right." As Marcus walked back toward the janitor's storage area, he felt like he was seeing Fort Braxton with new eyes. For 3 years, he had moved through these corridors like a ghost, invisible and unnoticed. But now, carrying his Medal of Valor in its wooden box, he felt a connection to this place and these people that he hadn't experienced since his military retirement. Frank Rodriguez was waiting for him in the storage room, looking anxious and worried. "Marcus, what happened? I saw you come out of the colonel's office, but those internal affairs guys left an hour ago looking like they'd seen a ghost." Marcus sat down on a stack of supply boxes and opened the wooden box, revealing the Medal of Valor inside. Frank's eyes widened as he recognized the significance of the decoration. "Jesus, Marcus, is that really yours?" "It is now," Marcus replied. "It's a long story, Frank, but the short version is that the investigation is over, the charges have been dropped, and those 5 recruits won't be bothering anyone anymore." "And your background?" Marcus closed the box and looked at his supervisor. "Let's just say that I haven't always been a janitor, but I'd appreciate it if we could keep that between us." Frank nodded slowly. "Of course. But Marcus, if you're really who I think you are, what are you doing working here? Shouldn't you be, I don't know, training Special Forces soldiers or working for the Pentagon or something?" "Maybe," Marcus admitted. "Colonel Harrison offered me the chance to come back to active duty. I'm still thinking about it." "What's holding you back?" Marcus thought about the question carefully. For 3 years, he had been hiding from his past, trying to forget the missions, the battles, the men he had lost. But tonight, holding his Medal of Valor again, he realized that running away from his history hadn't brought him peace. It had only brought him isolation and regret. "I guess I'm ready to stop hiding," he said finally. Frank smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, whatever you decide, you'll always have a job here if you want it. But somehow, I don't think you're going to be pushing a mop for much longer." As Marcus prepared for what might be his last night shift as a janitor at Fort Braxton, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been a broken man, destroyed by betrayal and consumed by guilt over the soldiers he couldn't save. Tonight, he was a decorated veteran with a second chance at the career he had always loved. The wooden box containing his Medal of Valor sat on the shelf above his cleaning supplies, a tangible reminder that heroes don't stay hidden forever. Sometimes, all it takes is the right person recognizing who you really are to bring you back into the light. Marcus Chen, a.k.a. Master Sergeant Daniel Chen, picked up his mop and bucket one last time. Tomorrow, he would have some serious decisions to make about his future. But tonight, he had floors to clean and a base to maintain. It was honest work, and for the first time in 3 years, he was proud of who he was, both in uniform and out of it. The quiet veteran had been cornered by recruits who thought they knew everything about power and respect. But they had learned the hard way that true strength comes not from family connections or political influence, but from service, sacrifice, and the courage to do what's right even when no one is watching. And sometimes, that strength is hidden behind a janitor's uniform and a simple name tag, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to the world.